I rise today in strong support of H.R. 6552, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2022. I want to thank the ranking member of our subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights, Representative Chris Smith, who I have worked closely with for many years to develop this bill. This joint effort has served as a daily reminder that collaboration in Congress is both imperative and far from finished when it comes to combating and eliminating human trafficking. This legislation is the overdue reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Act of 2000, which expired last September. To continue this essential fight to end global human trafficking, this measure must be passed by the House today so that more than 20 years of work is not undone. This bill is especially important in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, when virtual K-12 education made it harder for teachers to identify and report human trafficking. Prosecution of traffickers were delayed as courts closed, and the demand for social services for survivors increased as many of them lost their jobs and homes. Critically, this reauthorization strengthens provisions in the original bill that protect and support trafficking victims while reauthorizing $1 billion to fund programs across justice, homeland security, health and human services that are dedicated to addressing human trafficking and aiding victims. This funding includes $35 million in housing assistance grants for the victims of human trafficking, which offer temporary housing that provides trafficking survivors with meaningful alternatives to living with their abusers. It also funds education programs on trafficking warning signs for educators and law enforcement personnel who may otherwise unknowingly encounter trafficking victims, and it further requires greater accountability measures to protect people who are trafficked while appropriately punishing traffickers. In the U.S., the populations most vulnerable to human trafficking include migrant laborers, minorities, people with disabilities, those in the LGBTQ community, and especially runaway and homeless youth, and those in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And in regard to sex trafficking, which is where the child welfare system comes in, the average age of the victim is 12 years old. As a former healthcare professional and chair of the subcommittee, I have been a champion of child welfare issues throughout my time in Congress. I've seen too many instances of human rights violations against children and other vulnerable populations falling victim to the abuses of human trafficking, both in the U.S. and around the world. We must take this issue seriously and continue taking a whole of government approach to addressing it. Sometimes, however, we focus on the international and forget that this is a problem right here in many cities around our nation. The Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act adds several new provisions to the original legislation that will substantially improve our efforts against trafficking here at home, while only slightly modifying existing provisions that have been successful throughout its passage. One important example is the modifications made to existing HHS grants that would train elementary and secondary school teachers, children, guardians, and trainers in the recognition and response to child trafficking. Child trafficking in the U.S. is not labor trafficking, but it's sex trafficking. This section now focuses authorities to ensure that grantees will use proven best practices, trains personnel with equitable approaches, and identify service gaps, amongst other things. It also calls on state child welfare agencies to prioritize the implementation of protocols to report on missing and abducted children to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and law enforcement. Additionally, the bill requires states to submit annual reports on child sex trafficking victims to Health and Human Services, which is just one of the many steps that we can take to trace, track, and find those missing, and hopefully create a system that prevents further disappearance of our youth.
Madam Speaker, I want to convey my very special thanks to Chairwoman Karen Bass for her exceptional leadership, partnership, and friendship. For years, we have worked together to combat the unspeakable crime and abject cruelty of sex and labor trafficking. The Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act is just the latest bold initiative in our mutual commitment to end modern-day slavery. I want to thank Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and especially Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for having favorably reported the bill from the Foreign Affairs Committee on February 9th. Majority Leader Hoyer was especially helpful and has ensured timely consideration during this month of July, just in time to commemorate World Day Against Trafficking in Persons.
Madam Speaker, H.R. 6552, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act, as amended, should be supported by every member participating in today's vote. This overdue reauthorization strengthens laws that not only support those who have already fallen victim, but also prevent future risk of trafficking, both at home here in the U.S. and abroad. We must supply housing for victims so that they can have a safe place to go when they leave their abusers. We also must ensure that child welfare, foster children are prioritized, particularly young women, girls, and those who are part of the LGBTQ community are protected and aided with resources. Without housing, these children often have no choice but to return to their pimps, to their traffickers. Our departments must have the funding they need so they can offer the best training and personnel to respond to this crisis. It is our duty as public servants to protect the vulnerable and stop this heinous crime when and where it is discovered. Human trafficking, we know, is a heinous violation of human rights, and we must do everything within our power to combat it, and that includes passing this bill. Again, I want to thank the staff who've worked very hard on this, and especially want to thank the ranking member who we have worked together for 12 years. And as my time in Congress draws to a close, I am very happy that this is one of the last pieces of legislation that we move forward together. So I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 6552? All those say aye. As amended, excuse me. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Respect the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.